let us prepare ourselves. 9 o'clock people, you're not used to this, but we'll go ahead and get you used to it now. If you just put your hand over your eyes and open your eyes. And I open my eyes to see the spiritual truth today.
I open my eyes to see the spiritual truth today.
And your ears, I open my ears to hear the spiritual truth today.
I open my ears to hear the spiritual truth today.
And now put your hand over your heart and extend out your arms. I open my heart to receive the spiritual truth today.
I open my heart to receive the spiritual truth today.
The spiritual truth that I'm working with today is that with God, all things are possible. With God, all things are possible. And by that, I mean you just don't have to do it alone. You don't have to do your life by yourself. If you want even more success than I know most of us have right now, bring the power of the Almighty. Bring the power of infinite intelligence. Bring the power of divine wisdom into your life. And if we can co-create, begin to co-create with Spirit a life that's even better than ours. Today's spiritual truth. With man, some things are possible. With God, all things are possible. With God, we have the self-confidence to walk in any room and know that we belong in that room, no matter who's there and no matter how we're feeling about ourselves that day. With God, we have that kind of self-confidence. With God, we have the ability to really understand who we are and begin to define who we are. Well, today we're going to celebrate Hanukkah, which is a demonstration of this principle. With God, all things are possible. And as we do with each of these holidays that we've celebrated so far, we start the message with a blessing of the altar. So I'm going to ask Carol Trachtenberg to come forward, and we're going to do this as a team. These candles are typically, this is the second day of Hanukkah, so typically you would only light 2 candles, but I've asked Carol to light all of the candles today. It does. We got them in there good. Okay. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to light the lights of Hanukkah. Amen. Thank you, Carol. Yes. Okay. The way that we, first, let me say what I say every year. That Hanukkah is not a replacement holiday for that parents of Jewish kids dreamt up in order to give them presents. Because Christian kids were getting presents this time of year. It is not that kind of a holiday. It's a holiday, a standalone Jewish holiday that actually has been going on for a long, long time. It's not one of the biggest and the most sacred of the Jewish holidays. It's a holiday of joy and celebration. It's a holiday of hope, but it is a standalone holiday that is not just put in there so that kids could not feel bad during this time of year. We show respect in this church by telling the story of Hanukkah, because that's how Jewish homes are celebrating this season. They retell the story. They retell the story so that they can give their children both spiritual and cultural nourishment. And so they just keep retelling it and retelling it and retelling it, and that's what I'm going to do every year that I'm here in ministry when we celebrate Hanukkah. I'm just going to keep retelling the story. Now, you have the opportunity to go to sleep. If you've been coming here for a while, you have the opportunity to say, oh, I've heard that, I know that. See, the story's not going to change. But I promise you this, you have changed since you've last heard the story. And there's something in this story, this day, 2016, that will give you a blessing if you don't fall asleep. If you stay with it and begin to see, okay, I've changed. How does this story begin to fit with me now in this time? See, a Jewish proverb is that God so loved stories that he invented people. And I think that's kind of how Hanukkah stories get retold over and over again. This story happened when the time in the area known as Persia was good for the Jews. It was actually, they were doing okay. They were under the rule of a man named Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, you know, he respected the Jews. He let them worship as they wanted to worship. He let them have a God of their own understanding. He let them speak their own language in their communities. He allowed them to dress as they wanted to dress. He was kind of a benevolent ruler. And so the Jews didn't have a hard time of it all. But you know, here is the thing. When something has to go from good to great, often something happens in the middle to make that happen. There has to be a shift in order for us to take something that's okay into the great that we were intended to take our life into. See, things weren't terrible, but they weren't free either. They were dependent on Alexander the Great's benevolence. Now, I know there are people in the room this morning, and I've certainly been there in my life, and probably if I examined my life carefully, I would find there are places in my life where I don't feel entirely free. I'm not willing to rock the boat to make things go from okay to great, but I don't feel entirely free in my life. Maybe there's somebody here who doesn't feel entirely free in the workplace. Somebody doesn't feel entirely free with their adult children. Somebody doesn't feel entirely free even with their spouses. That there are some areas, things are okay, they're not bad, but they're not what they could be. And your soul will call you always to a place of what could be, the great that could be. So if that's happening for you, listen carefully now, because if you are not free, your soul will begin to invite in experiences in your life that will make it impossible for you to remain silent. You will have to either speak up or move. And if you leave, if you run away, if you have a geographic, you will simply take yourself with you, because everywhere you go, there you are. And so we ask people to really pay attention to where you're feeling a little unfree, a little stuck in your life. Well, the communal soul of the Jews called in the death of their benevolent leader in order to go from okay to better in their life. Their benevolent leader died and was replaced by a full-out anti-Semite. His name was Antiochus. And Antiochus was fearful of the Jews. He was fearful of how they dressed, how they spoke, how they raised their families. He was just fearful about everything. Now, he was fearful that they only had one God, when Greeks had many, many gods. Now, here is the thing. You and I are all parts of every story, every sacred story, whether it comes from the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or the sutras. We're all parts of those stories. And we're part of this story too. We are Alexander the Great. Whenever we come up against somebody in our life that is way different for us, that we don't really get. And you know, we can act all liberal and all progressive and all oneness, and we can all do that. But there are people in each of our lives that we don't kind of get. And we might even have a little fear around them. But here's the thing. When we are Alexander the Great, we just allow ourselves to be in the presence of them. We may not like it yet. We may not understand it yet. But for those people we really don't connect with, we're reflecting Alexander the Great, the consciousness of Alexander the Great, when we just allow them to be in our life. And conversely, we are also Antiochus. The violence that we see against people of color is an Antiochus violence. The violence we see against, and just the miserable, subtle oppression of fat people in this country. And some of us are uncomfortable around fat people. And what we do is we make them less than by our voice, by our comments, by our looks. We're being Antiochus in that moment. Old people, sometimes we're not with people who are mature. We begin to behave as Antiochus behaves because we're afraid of being old ourselves. And so we get into that mindset of Antiochus. This whole idea of a Muslim registry that is being talked about now is Antiochus moment in our lives. Because we know that God comes in all shapes, all sizes, all colors, all religions in our lives. When we limit other people, when we don't take the time to get to know one another, and that's really the answer. Getting to know one another is the answer. That's what will take us to a place of fear to no fear. And that's really the only way. We can have good manners and not behave oppressively, or we can actually learn about one another and become one with one another, and it actually hurts us to think about becoming oppressive to one another. Well, when we limit other people, there is a consequence. There is a consequence. When we limit somebody that we don't understand, maybe it's a biker, maybe it's a conservative talk show host, maybe it's Donald Trump, maybe it's an evangelical preacher, maybe it's the governor of North Carolina. I understand now that people are trying to limit his powers because he's more liberal than some of the other people there. Whenever we try and limit anybody, it doesn't work. Antiochus, and what happens is we run the risk of missing a blessing. I know that every person in this room has experienced a blessing by somebody who was totally different than they were. You've experienced a blessing by somebody who you never expected to experience that blessing from. So when we put each other out, when we're having our Antiochus behavior, we miss our own blessings so often in our life. Well, Antiochus' fear, he dealt with his fear of Jewish people by forbidding them to observe the Sabbath, by forbidding them to worship the God of their understanding. He actually, when they were under the rule of Alexander the Great, they built a beautiful synagogue on the top of Jerusalem. And in the synagogue, they put a beautiful ark, which is simply a little box where you put the sacred scrolls in it. So they had a gorgeous little ark in this synagogue, and they also had a 24-hour candle, and just to signify that God is on the job all the time. That's what that signifies, that little candle in their life. Well, Antiochus, when he was having his temper tantrum, he went in and he put a big a statue of Zeus in the temple. And then he slaughtered a pig all over the altar. And the significance is the pig is that the Jews didn't eat pork. They didn't eat pig. And so he slaughtered the pig just to try and rub it in a little bit more, if he could. Well, here's what happens. Control by physical or emotional force won't work in the long run. You may have a minute of short-term compliance, and maybe it'll even be years of compliance. But in the end, controlling other people by force, either emotional or physical, will not work. See, it worked in the shorter term, and I don't mean that it's short term for the people who lived through it, because it wasn't. It was generations of slavery. But slavery eventually ended in this country. We had internment camps, which is a huge embarrassment to this country. But they eventually ended. Apartheid eventually ended in this country. Muslim registry will not fly. I just don't believe that those of us who are around won't stand up and say that we cannot have a registry of human beings. See, it won't work in the long run because the presence of God will begin to move forward in our lives. We all have to stand up sometimes when scary things are happening to us and say, this is who I am. And that's what happened in the Hanukkah story. In the Hanukkah story, the Greek soldiers went around and they gathered people up in the villages and they would make the men bow down. They would take them by the neck and they would make them bow down to a false god, for them a false god, to statues of Zeus in the villages. And I always talk about this part of the story because I think it has an important point for us. And that is to not be too judgmental to people who are not able to stand up to tyranny. And we have to love them to a place where they can stand up to tyranny, because we've all fallen short. There have been times for all of us where we've masqueraded ourselves to be something that we aren't, to keep ourselves safe or to keep ourselves moving. Maybe you didn't graduate from college, but you let people think you did. Maybe you popped your kid once or twice, but you didn't want anybody to find that out. Maybe, you don't really have any food in your refrigerator, but you leave the empty milk carton in the refrigerator in case anybody comes by to see it. That was my mother's trick. She was having a moment in which she couldn't be herself. We all have those moments, and we have to have compassion for one another. There's a time in which gay people couldn't come out of the closet because it wasn't safe. And there were other people who made them feel guilty and bad about that. That's a Hanukkah part of the story. We don't want to make anybody feel bad because at that moment, they don't have the courage to stand up. But there was one man who did stand up, and he threw them off. And what he said to the people around them is, get back, whoever is for God, join me. And he ran off. And he had 5 sons, and the 5 sons ran off with him. And they formed a little band. And I like to talk about this forming of the little band every Hanukkah story because each and every one of us need to be in a little band of some kind, a band of rebels. That's what they were. They were a little band of rebels. They called themselves the Maccabees. They hammered back. And as they began to have some success in their little band of rebels, other people joined them. And that's important. That's the law of attraction at work. Whenever we are willing to stand up and form a little band of rebels and do the work that rebels do. Now, I'm not talking about going out and shooting people, but I am talking about standing up for the values that you and I have, the value of oneness, the value of compassion, the value of harmony, the value of prosperity. Whenever we form a little band of rebels that are in agreement, we begin to attract new people to us. And other people want to be a part of what it is that we're doing. Well, this really worked Antiochus's last nerve, because the little band that was growing now of Maccabees, the hammers. They would sleep during the day, and they would run out at night, and they would find a group of soldiers, of Greek soldiers, and they just hammer them back. So Antioch says, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm going to bring the entire Greek army, and we're going to solve this in one battle in one day. And that's what he did. He decided to settle that battle in one day. So in the morning, he got his soldiers up, and they began to put on their armor. And I think this is an important part of the teaching of the story, because they put on so much armor, they couldn't move. And you and I do that in the mornings when we get up. We put our own armor on. We put the armor of excuses on. We get them all lined up before we even leave the house. We tune up our blamer, and we get that going really well. That's our armor. And when we do that, we can barely move, and we certainly can't receive. Well, what happened is they had so much armor that the sure-footed Maccabees came running out, and they beat them back. And they beat them back. And they died. And see, that's a little bit of what happens, not a physical death for us. But when we're not careful to begin to know who we are and form bands of rebels that will help us support our values, and we simply put on our armor to make ourselves individually feel safe in the world, we die a little bit. And that's what happened. Well, the Maccabees were successful, so they went back into the temple. And the first thing they did with the temple is the most important part of the whole Hanukkah story for me. Everybody has their own parts that they like. But the part that I like is they went in and they looked at what a mess their beautiful temple was, and they cried. They wept. That's all they did. They sat down and wept. And you and I as metaphysicians, we need to take this part of the story at heart, because sometimes we don't give our feelings enough play. We don't give ourselves time to cry. We immediately go to, well, you know, it's all in God's time. Yes, I'm devastated, but it's probably a good thing for me. I learned something. You know, you did learn something. That's not the time to figure it out. That's the time to simply cry, to weep, to get your feelings out. And then you're ready. Once you have expressed your feelings, you're ready to do what they did next, which is to clean up, to repair, to put it all back to right, just how they wanted it. They swept and they mopped, and they cleaned and they replaced windows. And you and I can do that after we weep. After that period of grief, that's when the rebuilding starts. After the weeping of the relationship that didn't work out, that's when the rebuilding starts. After the weeping of the job that is lost, that's when the rebuilding starts. When we try and rebuild without the weeping, we're not nearly as successful, because we've got so much going on inside. You know, in this church, you often hear somebody say, change your thinking, change your life. I don't say it anymore, because while it's true, it gives us the false impression that we just have to think a new thought. And there's much more than that. There is that. But there is also attending to the vibration of the energy that we're putting out. And when you try and stuff down sadness, when you try and stuff down tears, you can't begin the work you need to do. It will be like gum on your spiritual shoes. You'll move, but at a very slow pace. in your life? Well, they got it all cleaned up, and they went to light the candle, and this is what most people think is the most important part of the story. They went to light the candle, and they only had 1 day's worth of oil to light the candle. And the candle needed to be an eternal candle for the flame not to go out. And the Jews did what you and I need to do. They lit the candle. They didn't worry about how they were going to get the rest of the oil. They had a plan. They had several plans. Several different parts of the Hanukkah story have different endings of how they got the oil back there. But the important thing is they didn't wait until things were perfect before they began. And that's what we need to do. We need to not wait to light the candle of our dream job until we get the job. We don't need to wait until we get our dream partner to light the candle. Light it now. You don't need to wait until your marriage gets better. Light the candle now. It's God's job to figure out how that will come to be. But it will come to be. But it won't come to be unless we begin. Unless we light the candle and move forward. So that's our homework this week. Our homework this week is to figure out one little area of our life that we would like to just rekindle. And then begin to light the candle. And let God do God's work. Let's take this message into prayer. There's only one power. It's the power of love, and it runs through me all the time. It runs through me in English, in Yiddish, in Swahili, in Hebrew, in every language I can think of. Love runs through that language. I give thanks for that. I give thanks for every single person here today. For helping to create an atmosphere in which we can gather and celebrate all the traditions that bring love to the surface. I give thanks. I release this word into the law, and together we say, and so it is.